Hi, welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I'm sharing a list of 30 classics I think everyone should read. I did a video last month where I went through a list of 30 books you should read before you die, 30 classics, and it was through Forbes. And not only was I a little bit off put by the list, but so were many of you in the comments. That list had no French literature, no Russian literature, didn't even have any Shakespeare or ancient literature whatsoever. It was disproportionately American and also mostly modern classics. And so that was really surprising to me. And I realized that everyone's list of what they think are books you should read are going to be vastly different based on your own experiences, based on where you live, what is influential, and sometimes even just based on your own personal preferences. So I tried to be mostly objective with this list. I included books because of their influence, and it's important for you to know that I do live in America, and so a lot of these books that are considered influential to me are more Western books. I'm sure there's lots of other classics I could have found that would have been quite valuable, but these are listed based on things that I find have had influence or long-lasting impact on culture or the genres that they are part of, or entertainment, like, that they have had ripple effects in the entertainment industry. So these are not selected because these are my 30 favorite classics, but because I think they're 30 important classics. There is a little bit of a cheat in here in that there's a couple of these that I'm talking about an author that I think is important, and I might give like one or two of their works that I think are especially influential, but I didn't want a list of 30 to have multiple spots for the same author because that just seems silly. And again, your list might differ very much from mine, so I'd love to hear in the comments what books you think you would put on here that maybe I didn't put, because it's fun to hear what different people consider to be important literature. I do think that most of the classics on this list are older classics, because that was another conversation, is what defines a classic. And in my opinion, I feel like a classic should be like 100 years or more old, but I think that modern classics still are important and still count. So there are still some modern classics on here, but there were a lot of books that were on the list for the other list that I was talking about that were like published in like the 70s or the 80s, which feels like especially modern for a modern classic, but maybe that's just because I was born in the late 80s, and so that maybe that just hits too close to home for me and makes me feel old. I don't know. So I did try to do a mix. Most of these are older, but there are a few modern classics on this list as well. So with all that introduction, let's dive into the list. This is in no particular order. They're just here. So the first book on the list is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This is a French classic, and something that I find particularly interesting about this is that it was written by a person of color, which a lot of older classics are not. And I think that that's part of the reason why Forbes' list was skewed the way that it was, is because they wanted to include more diversity and more Black authors, which is definitely laudable, and I think that that's a great thing. But they didn't even include this one, which is actually an old classic written by a person of color, so I find that really interesting. Anyways, this is a classic tale of revenge, and I recommend it to people often when they're looking for a classic that maybe is a bit more intimidating but still relatively accessible, because I find The Count of Monte Cristo to be like very plot heavy. And I think one of the things that is challenging to people with classics is that classics tend to be more slow paced and more character based. And I think that this is more plot heavy, although it is slow paced at times. I couldn't have a classics everyone should read list without including some Dickens. And I actually had a hard time choosing which Dickens I should include here. Neither of the ones that I'm going to mention are my favorites, but I'm mentioning both of them because of their cultural significance. So if you're going to read a Dickens and you've never read a Dickens at all, ever, the two that I would say start with one of these is A Christmas Carol. First of all, because of its brevity, and secondly, because it's such a well-known story that has completely integrated itself into Christmas in Western culture, and so I find it to be very important for that reason. And I also think Oliver Twist is a good starting point for Dickens as well, again, because of its cultural relevance, because there have been so many retellings, so many things based on Oliver Twist. Like, most people know the "Please, sir, I want some more" line because of Oliver Twist. So again, I also feel like this is a little bit more like plot heavy than some of Dickens' works as well, and it is shorter than a lot of his later works. The first of a couple of Russian classics that I've included on this list is, of course, Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky. I think everyone should try Dostoevsky at least once, and Crime and Punishment was not only my introduction into Dostoevsky, but also my introduction into Russian literature as a whole. I find it to be so gripping and so interesting. So I really love Crime and Punishment, and Crime and Punishment is actually one of my favorite books of all time. So maybe this is a case where my bias is coming in, where I have selected like my favorite Russian literature book of all time and my favorite Dostoevsky of all time. But I also find it to be one of Dostoevsky's most accessible works. Next up, we have Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, which was included on the Forbes list, but I think that this is just a wonderful, cozy book that everyone should read. There have been so many adaptations of this made. It's very well known in America, but I think the book is better than the movies, especially Marmee, the mother of these four sisters, the little women that we follow, and her wisdom is just so beautiful, and I love it. I want to be more like Marmee. Next, we have Pride and Prejudice, which is not my favorite Jane Austen novel, but I think it is the most well-known, and I think there have been so many retellings of this, so many times that this has been, flipped on its head, and modern retellings of it, and so many different movie adaptations and things like that, that I think that it has been the most influential of her works. And so if you're going to prioritize the Jane Austen, I think Pride and Prejudice should be the one that you go for first. The next book on this list is 1984 by George Orwell. I would say that this is one of the most influential dystopian novels of all time. There are many other dystopian novels that are well loved and that are important, but 1984 just takes the cake for me. Again, super influential. You hear the phrase Big Brother all the time, and that comes from 1984. This list would not be complete without a Bronte sister, and in fact, I've included two on here. So the first one is Jane Eyre, because Jane Eyre is just iconic, and it's one of those classics where if someone says, "I don't read that many classics, what's a place you recommend me to start?" I would often recommend Jane Eyre because it's really easy to get into, and even though it's a longer book, I think that it reads really quickly and is quite compelling. The other Bronte book I want to include is probably a controversial one because I think most lists would and do include Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, but I'm including The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This is actually not my favorite Anne Bronte, but I think it's a really important work examining like the rights of women and alcoholism and abuse in the Victorian time period and how that affected women and wives. And so I think it's really important and really well written, reads really fast, so compelling. It made me so angry. I haven't hated a character as much as I hated one of the characters in this book for like a really long time. Back to another American classic, The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne is one that I think is an important book examining kind of like the unfair stereotypes and unfair ways that women were being treated in this time period. And so I think it's an important book. I don't know that everyone's going to find it necessarily compelling. It depends on how you feel about Hawthorne's writing, because I've found his writing style to be kind of polarizing, and some people love it, some people are bored to tears by it. But I do think that it's really, really important, and I think that there have been lots of portrayals or retellings or representations of the ideas or the plot of The Scarlet Letter in modern culture. I don't think a list of classics you should read would be complete without Agatha Christie, the queen of mystery herself. Different people have different favorites of Agatha Christie, but I think the book that I feel like if you're gonna read one, if you've never read any Agatha Christie and you want to just try one, I would recommend And Then There Were None. There is a group of strangers that have all been invited to this island, and they don't know why, and they don't know each other, and one by one they start to die. And this has been done so many times in movies and TV shows and more modern books and all that kind of stuff. And Agatha Christie, as far as I know, was the first person to do it. I think that she revolutionized the mystery genre. So That's why I think it's important. A book I haven't finished, but I find to be very important and I want to read the whole way through, even though I've soft DNF'd it, is Don Quixote by Cervantes. And this is an intimidating one because of its length. And the reason that I DNF'd it was not because the language was difficult, but because it was feeling a little repetitive and I just had too much going on. But anyways, I think that this is really important because this is something that's referenced a lot, especially you've probably heard of like, you know, the tilting at windmills, like that phrase comes from Don Quixote. There's actually a word, how do you even pronounce it? Is it like quiotical? Ignore my pronunciation, but I'll put it on the screen. There's a word that was invented in the English language because of Don Quixote. A book that I think is important because of the ideas that it talks about that I haven't yet read, but I plan to read soon, is Passing by Nella Larson, which is all about a Black woman whose skin is light enough that she can pass for white. So it's very much examining racism within the United States, and I think it's a really important one. Another author that I think is really important because of his contributions to his genre is H.G. Wells, who is often referred to as the father of science fiction. So there's a lot of different ways you could go with H.G. Wells, but I think one of his more well-known books is The Time Machine. So that's the one I'm going to insert here. I probably could have done War of the Worlds also because that's had a lot of like rippling effects in terms of like media and movies and all that kind of stuff. But I think The Time Machine was definitely like revolutionary for its time, as was most of his works, because science fiction wasn't quite as developed as a genre, and he did a lot to shape what modern sci-fi looks like. Someone else who shaped a genre is J.R.R. Tolkien, and the Forbes list had The Hobbit on there, which I would argue is probably more accessible than what I'm going to recommend, but I think you need to read Lord of the Rings. I love Lord of the Rings, and that's no surprise. I think that Lord of the Rings is a better representation of Tolkien's genius in that it spans a lot more than The Hobbit, which, I mean, you could argue Lord of the Rings is not one book, it's 3, but it was originally like intended to be an entire book, and then it just got split up for publication reasons. And you can buy books that have the entirety of the Lord of the Rings in one volume, so I'm counting it as one book, and I don't care if that's cheating. J.R.R. Tolkien did so much to kind of develop like the quest trope that you see in modern fantasy, as well as like the chosen one trope, and like all these different things that you see so commonly in fantasy was really well represented by Tolkien, as well as his genius in just creating worlds and races and even creating entire languages. Tolkien was a genius. This is again an area, one that I'm kind of cheating because I'm including 2 books in this slot because they go together, and that is the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. I actually haven't read these yet. Again, I feel like this is so influential. Greek mythology and Greek literature has had like long-lasting effects on culture, on entertainment, on storytelling. And so I think that when you read a lot of these older classics, you can see where these things began and appreciate it and see references, like understand references that you see absolutely everywhere. Another author that's the same way in terms of like, once you read them, you will see the references everywhere is Shakespeare. There's so many phrases, words, and plot lines that come from Shakespeare. I could recommend so many different Shakespeare for this, but I'm gonna give you 2. Again, this is another one where I'm cheating, kind of like I did with Dickens. So I'm gonna give you 2 that I feel like are especially influential, but really all of Shakespeare is influential. The most obvious one I think is Romeo and Juliet, because this is a plotline that's been done over and over again with star-crossed lovers, people coming from families that aren't getting along. You see this in so many movies, in so many books, and Shakespeare was the master. And I also want to recommend Macbeth, because Macbeth is just bubble, bubble, toil and trouble, and that's like the witches from Macbeth. And there's many other things that are referenced all the time. So those are the 2 where if you're going to read a Shakespeare, if you've never read one before, read one of those 2. Next up is a book that I think a lot of kids read in high school, and that's The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This is a really interesting book for multiple reasons, and there's so many different ways you can analyze it, but it has a lot to do with like the social elite in New York City during the 1920s. And so there's a lot of historical relevance to it, as well as a lot of themes that are really interesting. So yeah, you probably read this in high school because a lot of people do, but if you didn't, you should read it. Another author who I think is really important that I could recommend probably multiple works from is Ray Bradbury. I think most people would probably recommend Fahrenheit 451. Again, great classic dystopian book. Super relevant, especially in terms of censorship and book burning and all that stuff. I actually haven't read this yet. I'm going to read it in September. So I'm not technically recommending this book, even though I mentioned it. But the book I was going to recommend is Something Wicked This Way Comes, which actually the title is a quote from Macbeth. So there you go. There's correlation already. But I think Something Wicked This Way Comes is fascinating. Like, it is such a great, like, spooky book without being like absolutely horrific, like, you know, Stephen King level horrific. It's really creepy. It's really weird, but the themes are so deep and beautiful and meaningful, and I think everyone should try Something Wicked This Way Comes. I have a couple of books in a row here that I think greatly influenced pop culture and entertainment. The first of which is Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is not the original vampire story, but it is one of the most influential ones. So I highly recommend Dracula. It's really interesting because it's kind of like mixed media. You've got letters, you've got journal entries, you've got narrative, so it's like mixed all together. Super fascinating. The character of Van Helsing is introduced in Dracula, and you see Van Helsing in other things, mostly vampire things, but sometimes other things as well. But it's really interesting to read a book that shaped something that there have been so many vampire and Dracula movies made. I would also say Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which is so different than our modern interpretation of Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. And you know, you get this image in your head of like this green guy walking around, monstrous, scary, like all this stuff. And it is portrayed so differently in Mary Shelley's novel, and I was unprepared for how deep it was and how beautifully written it was. No classics you should read list would be complete without a Steinbeck, in my opinion. So I'm including East of Eden here, which is actually one of his longest, if not his very longest novel, but I also think it's his most masterfully done. It's kind of a retelling of Cain and Abel and like all of that kind of thing. There's a lot of biblical references in it. It's just an incredible book, and I think that everyone should read it. Another work that has greatly influenced pop culture is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. I'm sure we've seen, you know, the cartoon Sleepy Hollow with Ichabod Crane. There have been lots of scary movies made about this. There's been a lot of things that have been based on the original, and I think the original is terrific. It's funny, it's witty, it's so descriptive. I love it. On a more serious note, another Russian classic that I want to include here, more of a modern Russian classic, is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. This is basically one day in the Gulag, written by the author of the Gulag Archipelago. And so this is really examining what was it like to be in the Gulag, to be imprisoned there. And it's a difficult read in terms of like, there's so many things that happen that you're like, oh my gosh. But I think it's really important. Next up, we have a really big chunker that's really intimidating, but I think it's really important, and that's Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. I feel like the French classics that I put on here are giant. They are absolutely giant. Again, such an important work of literature, not only because of the vast success of the Broadway musical, which was then also turned into movies, but like it is just such a powerful story, and it's worth reading. And if you're someone that you're like, oh my gosh, this is too long, this is too scary, this is one of those books where I actually think an abridged version is okay, because Hugo goes on so many side tangents, which I actually found most of them to be quite interesting and relevant, because a lot of his side tangents have to do with the socioeconomic status of Paris at the time, leading to the rebellion, leading to the other things that are going on. So I found them to be mostly interesting and mostly relevant, but I think that they are difficult and they break up the story. So it is one of those times where I'm like, yeah, I don't think the abridged version is a bad idea with this one. Next, we have The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. What list would be complete without Oscar Wilde? I actually considered including one of his plays instead, but I think The Picture of Dorian Gray is much more like impactful. You're going to be thinking about it for a really long time. It's very short, it's brilliant, and it's haunting. Highly recommend. Another author that I think you should read is Edgar Allan Poe. I think he has been so influential in so many ways. And this is one of those ones where I've got two for you again, but they're short stories as well. So first of all, I think that if you're going to read one work that you're like, okay, I want to try Poe and I've never tried him, The Telltale Heart, I feel like encompasses his feel and his brilliance. So that is usually like, that's one of the ones that I recommend very highly. But when a lot of people think of Edgar Allan Poe, they do think of his spookier stories, and they don't realize that he also wrote some detective stories. Edgar Allan Poe wrote The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is often considered the first modern detective story. So this predates Sherlock Holmes, this predates Wilkie Collins, this predates like all of these like famous mystery stories with detectives trying to solve the mystery, and a lot of them received inspiration from Edgar Allan Poe. He went on to write a couple more short stories with the same detective, The Mystery of Marie Roget, and then The Purloined Letter, but Murders in the Rue Morgue was the first one, and in my opinion, the best of the three. I'm realizing as I'm filming this that this is certainly a Victorian literature heavy list, but I feel like there's so much Victorian literature that's been very influential in modern culture. So I had to include a Thomas Hardy on here. And this is the one I'm going to recommend is actually not usually what I would recommend people start with Thomas Hardy. But I think that this is the most important Hardy book, so that's why it's on this list, and that's Tess of the D'Urbervilles. This, I think, is one of Hardy's most tragic works, and he's known for writing really depressing, horrible things of like everything that can go wrong goes wrong for these poor characters, and Tess is no exception to that rule. He does have some happier books, but I think Tess is the most important and written in a time period where, again, like women didn't have a lot of rights, and there was a very high double standard for men and women in the Victorian time period, and that's what Tess is about, and that's why I think it's so important. The next one is one I haven't read, so I'm kind of like including two things on this one as well, because there's different versions of this that you can read. But I think everyone should read a Faust story because Faustian tales are so prevalent in many works of literature and have continued kind of like still now today, where basically essentially a man making a deal with the devil for whether it be like wealth or intelligence or love or, you know, like whatever. He's making a deal where he's selling his soul in order to get this thing that he really wants. And so I think that the original Faust tales are really important for this. And the Faust legend is German. So the one I was going to recommend is Goethe's Faust, which I have not read. But I found out that the tragical history of Dr. Faustus, written by Christopher Marlowe, who was British, I'm pretty sure, actually predates Goethe's Faust, I think. So I feel like I should recommend Goethe's Faust because it is German and the legend of Faust is German in its origin, but a lot of people know about Dr. Faustus, and it was, I think, written before Goethe's. So I don't know which one's the right way to go here because I haven't read either of them. If you've read both, let me know which one you think is better in the comments. But this is one of those ones where I feel like this is really important because it has had so many effects on future books and movies and culture with this whole like, I mean, how often do you hear the phrase like making a deal with the devil? Like that comes from Faust. I think Robert Louis Stevenson is an author who has written a lot of really influential things. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is, again, another thing that has just permeated our culture, but the one that I am going to put on this list officially for him is Treasure Island. Treasure Island is like such a delight, and when I read it as an adult, it felt so familiar because there have been so many adaptations made of this, and I think our idea of what a pirate looks like, you know, like the peg leg and the parrot on the shoulder and all that kind of stuff, like it originates in Treasure Island. The last book on this list is another Russian classic, because I feel like how can you have a book of 30 classics everyone should read and not include a Tolstoy? You might think that this should be War and Peace in this slot, because when most people think of Tolstoy, they think of War and Peace, but I'm actually going to put Anna Karenina here for several reasons. First reason is the biased reason, and that is that I absolutely love Anna Karenina and I didn't love War and Peace. I liked it. I'm glad I read it. But I also think like I have seen more adaptations of Anna Karenina and have found more references to it in culture than I have War and Peace in terms of like the plot line and different things like that. You might disagree. You might have seen more lasting impact and influence of War and Peace. So maybe I should have put War and Peace in this spot. But I also think Anna Karenina is like a less scary place to start with Tolstoy because it is shorter, although it is still quite long. But I think it's more accessible than War and Peace, and so that's another reason why I put it here. Well, those are 30 classics that I think everyone should read before they die. And again, like I said, definitely skewed Western and things that I see as influential and represented a lot in culture surrounding me. So this list is pretty subjective for that reason, but I tried to be objective in terms of including books, not just because, oh my gosh, I love this book so much, although there are a few of those on here, but there are books that I would consider like favorites or classics that I recommend to people a lot that I did not include on this list because I didn't see them as influential as the books that I did include. I would love to hear from you in the comments down below. What would you add? What would you take away? I'm just really curious because I think everyone has a different opinion of what should be included or what should not. But again, you're also very limited when you're choosing 30 books. And I cheated by including more than 30 books technically when I had an author and I gave like 2 options, you know, so there's actually technically more than 30 books on this list. But when you're limiting yourself to 30, that's a lot less than if you're saying here's 100 classics you should read. That would be a different list and it would include a lot more people and be a lot easier to come up with 100 books than to narrow it down to 30 was actually really difficult. I had a much larger list than this and crossed off a whole bunch of things. So I'd be curious to hear what you would include. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.